Concrete evidence were hard-won principles forged in part from the ashes of Gallows Hill. In modern times, the phrase witch hunt has become shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, though it's often used with little regard for the real terror those words represent. In truth, Salem was not a metaphor. It was a town where people were hanged for imaginary crimes, betrayed by the very systems designed to protect them. Perhaps the most lasting lesson is this: fear unchecked can become its own form of tyranny. And when fear is legitimized by power, by courts, by churches, by governments, it becomes almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials are a cautionary tale, not just of one village's descent into madness, but of how easily reason can fall when fear is given authority. The gallows may be gone, the courtrooms quiet, but the warning still stands. Truth is fragile. Justice is not automatic, and history has a habit of repeating itself unless we remember. Fulvia was born around 83 B.C. into the elite, yet slightly eccentric Fulvi family, an old plebeian house that had long since clawed its way into the upper echelons of Roman politics. Though not one of the oldest patrician clans, the Fulvi had produced consuls, generals, and orators. Their bloodline carried both ambition and a taste for disruption. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was known more for his bumbling speech than his political legacy. His nickname, Bambalio, literally referred to his stammer. But Fulvia, she was no stammer. She was born to command. From a young age, Fulvia would have been surrounded by the sharp-edged world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policy in her home. Elections and treachery were daily news. She would have seen how politics wasn't just played in the forum, but in marriages, funerals, rumors, and backroom deals. Women in elite Roman households were expected to be quiet partners, refined, educated, and obedient. Fulvia would break all of those expectations. She was wealthy, highly educated, and connected. And she knew it. While her early life remains hazy in the historical record, her later actions suggest a young woman who was observant, politically literate, and utterly unafraid. This wasn't someone who faded into the background. She had a strong personality, a sharp political mind, and a will to act even in the male-dominated space of Roman governance. This was also a period of unprecedented instability. The Republic was unraveling. Civil wars, populist revolts, and power struggles between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into a pressure cooker. The old rules were collapsing, and Fulvia came of age right in the middle of it. Rather than recoil from chaos, Fulvia would learn to use it. Her early life didn't produce the kind of modest, matron Rome idealized. It produced a woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared, but as a battlefield to be mastered. She would go on to marry 3 powerful men, each one a radical player in Roman history. But Fulvia wouldn't just marry power. She would command armies, lead revolts, and become the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was ready for Rome. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Claius Pulcher, and it was anything but conventional. Claius was no ordinary Roman noble. He was a populist agitator, a political arsonist with a flair for chaos, scandal, and street-level power. To many of the Roman elite, he was dangerous. To the masses, he was a hero. And to Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity. Their marriage sometime in the early 50s BC united Fulvia with the man who had turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Claius was infamous for his theatrical defiance of tradition. He had once disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred female-only religious ceremony in Caesar's home. Scandalous behavior that only seemed to raise his popularity. He later renounced his patrician status to run for the tribunate of the plebs, an office that gave him veto power over the Senate. Claius understood Rome's street politics better than most, and Fulvia, far from being a passive consort, was right there beside him. She wasn't a silent partner. Roman sources suggest that Fulvia actively participated in her husband's political world. She engaged with his supporters, was visible during his campaigns, and managed their household as a hub for clay politics. Together, they represented a new kind of Roman power couple. Bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive. But the alliance came at a cost. In 52 B.C., Claius was murdered on the Ion Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annus Milo. His death sent shockwaves through Rome. But Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly. She staged a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She paraded Claius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, bloodied wounds exposed for maximum effect. The public was horrified and enraged. Riots erupted. The Senate House was burned to the ground. Fulvia had turned personal grief into public uprising. This was her first major political act, and it worked. Her ability to manipulate public emotion, use spectacle as strategy, and wield her husband's legacy as a weapon made her a new kind of player in Roman politics. Claius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of the shadow, and Rome would never see her the same way again. Fulvia didn't linger in mourning. In Rome, political capital had a short shelf life, and she understood that better than anyone. Shortly after the violent death of Claius Pulcher, she entered into a second marriage. This time to Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate supporters. On the surface, Curio seemed an unlikely match. He had a flamboyant reputation and a taste for drama, but beneath the bravado was a sharp political operator. As tribune of the plebs in 50 B.C., Curio wielded enormous influence during one of Rome's most volatile periods. The Republic teetered between war and peace, between Caesar's ambitions and the Senate's resistance. Fulvia saw in Curio not just a husband, but a bridge to the next power block. This was no romantic rebound. It was a calculated alliance. With Claius gone, Fulvia needed a new political anchor. Someone who could carry forward the populist legacy her first husband had built, and someone who had Caesar's backing. Curio fit both bills. Through him, Fulvia remained tightly embedded in the shifting power dynamics of Rome. She didn't just marry into the movement, she helped shape it. Fulvia ensured Claius's supporters stayed active, rebranding their cause under Curio's leadership and keeping the urban masses politically engaged. But the Roman world was collapsing fast. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey exploded into civil war. Curio threw himself into the fight, taking Caesar's side. Fulvia, as always, remained politically involved. She reportedly helped organize support and manage resources for her husband's campaign. In 49 BC, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to secure Caesar's position, but it was a disaster. He was ambushed and killed by the forces of King Juba the Numidia. His death was brutal and his army annihilated. Once again, Fulvia was widowed. And once again, Rome waited to see if she would fade into the background. She didn't. Curio's death only solidified her status as a political widow with dangerous resilience. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil unrest, and both had died fighting for populist causes. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious partnership and her most dramatic chapter was still to come. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal ally of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged sometime around 47 BC, wasn't merely a romantic attachment. It was a merger of power. Fulvia had already proven herself as a master of Roman street politics. Antony, rising rapidly through the military and political ranks, needed that kind of savvy support in Rome. Together, they formed one of the most politically potent couples of the late Republic. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and outmaneuvered countless enemies. Antony was no stranger to scandal either. He drank, he gambled, and his personal life was notoriously chaotic. But with Fulvia, he had found someone who could do more than entertain him. She could defend his interests, hold his alliances together, and rally supporters when he was away on campaign. And Antony, despite his brash exterior, understood her value. He allowed Fulvia to exercise authority that no Roman woman had publicly wielded before. She opened his correspondence. She issued orders in his absence. She sat in on meetings and influenced appointments. Roman sources, mostly hostile, depicted her as overbearing and power-hungry. But what disturbed them most wasn't her ambition. It was that she acted like a Roman man in a world that had no language for such a woman. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, the Republic was plunged into chaos once more. Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir. But it was Fulvia who held Rome itself. While Antony formed the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his representative in the capital, managing patronage networks, coordinating with street gangs, and ensuring Antony's supporters remained mobilized. She even helped arrange Antony's official reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter Cleia to him, an alliance that would later implode. In public, Fulvia appeared not just as Antony's wife, but as his proxy. Roman coins were minted, bearing both Antony's image and her name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her status. She wasn't hidden in the shadows of power. She stood in its full glare. But power in Rome was always borrowed, and Fulvia was about to test the limits of how far a woman could go before Rome snapped back. While Mark Antony pursued military campaigns and political deals across the Roman world, it was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Rome. She wasn't just his wife. She was his regent in all but name. In a period where violence, bribery, and raw influence kept order, Fulvia proved she could play the game as well as, if not better than, any man in the Senate. Rome in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination was a battlefield without swords. Power had become a moving target. Fulvia understood this, and she anchored Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his political substitute. She directed allies, dealt with the urban plebs, negotiated with factions, and most daringly waged war with words and silver. She financed loyal troops, offered bribes to keep public order, and ensured that any legislation passed favored Anani's future. Some ancient sources, especially hostile ones like Ion and Dioasius, paint Fulvia as manipulative, shrewish, and even warmongering. But beneath the misogynistic exaggeration lies a woman actively doing politics in a world that had no protocol for a woman doing anything beyond weaving and mourning. Fulvia was building coalitions, backing military commanders, and even issuing decrees, functions normally reserved for senators and consuls. She also made public appearances and maintained strong relationships with veteran soldiers, a politically vital demographic in the power struggles of the late Republic. While Antony was campaigning in the East, Fulvia was often the face of his authority in Italy, meeting with centurions, influencing decisions about land distribution, and reminding the soldiers that their loyalty to Antony came with rewards. But this accumulation of power came at a cost. Roman aristocrats, particularly the faction aligned with Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, resented Fulvia's influence. They viewed her as a meddling woman with too much sway over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her ability to act without male guardianship was not just threatening, it was unprecedented. Fulvia wasn't naive. She knew the tension between Antony and Octavian was growing. She could see that their alliance was cracking, and she understood something that neither man seemed to fully grasp yet. The Republic wasn't big enough for both of them. So, Fulvia began preparing for the next phase. Not diplomacy, but confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now, she was ready to take it into her own hands. In 41 BC, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus. And she didn't do it quietly. With her husband Mark Antony still stationed in the east, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a consul, took it upon themselves to challenge Octavian's authority in Italy. The cause? Ostensibly, it was to defend Antony's interests and protect the land rights of Roman veterans loyal to him. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints were everywhere. This was not just politics. This was a military rebellion led by a Roman woman. The first and only time in Roman history that a woman would actively provoke and organize a civil war. The conflict, known as the Perusane War, was triggered by Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, which displaced many Italians to reward his soldiers. Fulvia seized on the growing discontent, portraying Octavian as a tyrant and traitor to Caesar's legacy. With Lucius acting as her frontman in the Senate and Fulvia organizing behind the scenes, they raised 8 legions and seized the city of Perugia, modern-day Peru. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources suggest she was more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself. She rallied troops, stirred the public, and even corresponded with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions, issuing orders and forcing Lucius into confrontations he didn't want. Octavian, though surprised, acted quickly. He besieged Peru through the winter of 4140 BC, cutting off supplies and hammering the city into submission. Fulvia, stuck between dwindling food and political betrayal, watched her bold gamble unravel. By early 40,000 BC, the city surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely as a gesture to avoid alienating Antony, but Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once commanded riots, marriages, armies, and public opinion was now deemed too dangerous for Roman soil. She was sent to Sicuan in Greece, where she hoped to reunite with Antony. But Antony didn't come running. The once powerful alliance between husband and wife had eroded in the fog of war and distance. Fulvia had acted in his name, but perhaps without his blessing. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had before, wage a civil war. And now the Republic had made her pay the price. Banished from Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a city in Greece that had become a kind of diplomatic purgatory for failed power players. She had gone to war, not for personal gain, but in her husband's name. She believed she was defending Mark Anani's interests, his honor, and perhaps their shared vision of Rome. But what awaited her in exile wasn't a hero's welcome. It was silence. Fulvia had risked everything. Her status, her alliances, her life. And yet Antony did not immediately rush to meet her. In fact, by the time Fulvia arrived in Greece, Antony was already entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romantic relationship had begun or was merely brewing, the symbolism was crushing. While Fulvia was raising legions, Antony was raising goblets at banquets beside a queen. The betrayal cut deep, not just personally, but politically. Fulvia had fought a war to protect Antony's power in Italy, and in response, he let her hang out to dry. Some ancient historians, especially Plutarch, suggest that Antony was furious with her for launching the Parisine War without his direct approval. Others argue he welcomed her downfall. It cleared the way for a marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would have never tolerated. Still, Fulvia wasn't entirely without supporters. Some of Antony's troops, fiercely loyal to her, urged reconciliation. But her health had begun to fail. After enduring siege, exile, and betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BC, possibly from illness, stress, or heartbreak, or all three. She was around 43 years old. Her death provided Antony with a clean political exit. He met with Octavian shortly afterward and agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, as part of a renewed peace treaty. The triumvirs were temporarily united again, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs, was gone. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose myths nearly every Roman woman of the period. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. She didn't wield power from behind a curtain. She marched into it, stood at the center, and dared to command armies in a world that treated women as furniture. Rome didn't know what to do with her, so it erased her. But the ashes of her rebellion would linger, and her story was far from ordinary. After Fulvia's death in 40 BC, to the men she had once maneuvered, Antony, Octavian, and even her former allies, began the quiet work of rewriting her legacy. She couldn't defend herself, so the narrative was shaped by her enemies and the uneasy survivors of her ambition, and like so many powerful women in history, Fulvia became a scapegoat. Ancient sources, mostly penned by men with vested interests, painted her as the reason for the Pyrrhonian War, the rift between Antony and Octavian, and even the general disorder of the Republic. Ion, Dioasius, and Plutarch depict her as overbearing, jealous, and driven by a lust for power. They blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into conflict, for antagonizing Octavian, and even for Antony's eventual estrangement from Rome. But were these accusations fair? Hardly. Fulvia had operated within a political climate where violence and manipulation were expected, at least if you were a man. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian would eventually prove to be. Her only true deviation was that she was a woman, acting like a Roman man, and Rome didn't know how to digest that. She wasn't cloistered in the home, weaving quietly, or serving as a political ornament. She was writing letters to generals, organizing street mobs, and commanding loyalty from troops. And that made her dangerous, not just to Octavian but to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the man whose legacy she had fought to preserve, conveniently blamed Fulvia for the civil strife. After reconciling with Octavian and marrying his sister, Antony used Fulvia's death as a diplomatic cleansing. Her memory became the price of his political survival. There were no monuments raised in her honor, no grand funeral, no mourning speeches in the Senate, just silence. Yet her enemies couldn't erase her entirely. Fulvia had done too much. She had raised armies, steered elections, negotiated alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose name appeared on coinage, not as a deity or metaphor, but as a political agent. The damage to her reputation was deliberate, but so was her presence in the historical record. Despite every attempt to bury her behind caricature and slander, Fulvia refused to vanish. Her defiance still echoes. You just have to listen past the men. Fulvia's story ends in silence, but her legacy is anything but quiet. In the centuries that followed her death, historians and writers struggled to place her in Rome's grand narrative because Fulvia broke every rule of what a Roman woman was supposed to be. She didn't just advise power from the shadows. She became power, and that made her both unforgettable and deeply unsettling to a patriarchal world. In a society where women were expected to influence through whisper and marriage, Fulvia shouted through policy, war, and political theater. She was not a consort. She was a commander. And yet, she was remembered more for her defiance than her accomplishments. Roman historians couldn't handle a woman who didn't stay in her place, so they rewrote her as shrill, power, hungry, and disruptive. But read between the lines, and a different figure emerges. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to mint coins with her name. She organized political factions, leveraged marriage as a tactical weapon, and manipulated Roman street politics with stunning effectiveness. She moved through the civil wars of the 1st century BC not as a bystander, but as a player, a woman whose influence terrified senators and shaped the fate of triumvirs. Her downfall wasn't due to incompetence. It was due to timing and gender. Had she been born a man, she might have been remembered as a second Caesar or a more charming Cato. Instead, she was cast as the wicked woman who dared too much. Still, her legacy quietly lingered. Later Roman women like Livia Drusilla, Agrena the Younger, and even Cleopatra herself, though of a different world, would all operate in the shadow Fulvia helped carve. They would manipulate emperors, wield armies, and control succession. But Fulvia did it first, and with no imperial title to shield her. Today, modern historians have begun re-examining Fulvia with fresh eyes. No longer a cautionary tale, she's being recognized as one of the most politically active women in Roman history. Someone who tested the boundaries of female power and paid the price. She didn't simply live in the age of triumvirs, she challenged them. And while Rome may have tried to erase her, Fulvia left fingerprints in every corner of its collapse. Not a footnote of force. A woman centuries ahead of her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country teetering between two worlds. One rooted in centuries-old systems of oppression, and another aching to breathe free. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a social norm. It was the law. Black Americans were barred from restaurants, schools, buses, voting booths, and even drinking fountains. Police brutality was rampant. Lynching still occurred, and in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were being met with snarling dogs and high-press fire hoses. But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had surged into the national spotlight. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts had become familiar headlines. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just names. They were symbols of defiance. The March on Washington wasn't born out of a single conversation. It was the result of rising frustration and fierce hope. Black Americans were no longer content with waiting. They were demanding civil rights, and they were determined to make their voices heard where it mattered most, the nation's capital. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C. had been floating around for decades. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had originally proposed the concept in the 1940s. Back then, it was meant to pressure the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry. That protest was called off after Roosevelt caved and signed an executive order. But now, in 1963, the stakes were even higher. Randolph, along with other civil rights leaders including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. And this time they weren't just marching for jobs. They were marching for dignity, for voting rights, for school desegregation, for equal pay, and most importantly, for the basic human right to live free of fear. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations came together to plan it despite their many disagreements because they understood the power of a unified front. The countdown had begun. Buses were being organized. Flyers were spreading. Word of mouth was moving faster than newspapers. And across the country, Black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most unforgettable moments in American history. The dream was taking shape one footstep at a time. Pulling off a protest of any kind in Washington, D.C. was no small feat, but planning one for over 100,000 people, possibly more, was madness. Logistically, it sounded like a nightmare. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, bathrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, safety plans. And yet somehow they made it happen. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and often kept behind the scenes for political reasons, was a master strategist. Rustin had once studied nonviolence directly under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India. He had marched, been jailed, beaten, and surveilled by the FBI. But nothing fazed him. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, nonviolent protest could achieve when coordinated with military precision. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his team transformed the idea into a reality. The march was officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was deliberately framed to include both racial justice and economic opportunity. That dual message was no accident. While Dr. King would later become the spiritual symbol of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the demands were just as much about unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights as they were about civil rights. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were nervous, deeply nervous. They feared riots, backlash, or worse, bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful. Still, the National Guard was on standby. Hospitals in D.C. were put on alert, and liquor sales were banned for the day. Federal workers were even told they could stay home. And then there was the question of unity. The big 6 civil rights organizations, NAACP, CPS, SNCC, SCC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, often clashed over tactics. Some wanted more radical action, others more diplomacy. SNCC's young firebrands were growing impatient with King's nonviolent approach, but they all agreed on this. The time for silence had passed. Rustin's plan read like a military operation. Every bus and train was tracked. Every speaker was timed to the minute. Every route had marshals trained in crowd control. They weren't just planning a march. They were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation. August 28, 1963. A sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was already hot by 9 a.m., and the humidity clung to the skin like a second shirt. But it didn't stop them. From every corner of the country, they came. Black, white, young, old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best, others clutched protest signs. They came by bus, train, carpool, and even foot. Over 250,000 people in total converging on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. And yet, there was no chaos. Despite the government's fear of riots and unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm. Volunteers directed foot traffic. The Red Cross handed out water. Groups sang freedom songs, held hands, and cheered as new marchers arrived. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool and chants of jobs and freedom echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities joined in too. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was there for autographs. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause bigger than any one person. The crowd was orderly but energized. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a shared understanding that this wasn't just a protest. It was a sacred moment. For many Black Americans, just standing on the mall felt like a quiet act of revolution. To be seen, to be counted, to say we are here in front of the same Lincoln Memorial where the great emancipator sat in stone. It was a full-circle moment, generations in the making. At exactly noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different organizations, ideologies, and regions, but united in message. Speakers demanded equal pay, desegregated schools, a living wage, and an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang. Marian Anderson, who had once been banned from singing at Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands beneath the open sky. As the hours passed, the tension grew, not from unrest, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken. And when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember. The march wasn't just making history. It was becoming legend minute by minute. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had grown quiet. Not because they were tired, but because they knew what was coming. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely concealed the fire building inside him. He carried prepared remarks, typed and written collaboratively with his advisors the night before. But what the world would remember wasn't what had been typed. It was what came from his heart. He began with measured intensity, outlining the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence, not as fillers, but as instruments. The crowd listened in rapt attention, some nodding, some wiping away tears, others holding signs that simply read now. But it was what happened next that changed the tone of the entire event and arguably the trajectory of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. She suddenly cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium, and launched into a passage he delivered before, but never like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each phrase rang louder, clearer, more resolute. "I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character." It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history. By the time King closed with the words, free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty. We are free at last. The crowd erupted. Applause, tears, shouts of joy. They knew they had just witnessed something more than or try. They had heard prophecy. The power of the March on Washington wasn't just in the speeches or the music. It was in the people. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day was overwhelming. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and everywhere in between. Some were seasoned activists who had marched a dozen times before. Others had never left their hometowns until now. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in their church clothes just to be there. Many were ordinary people, maids, teachers, steel workers, postal clerks who saw themselves not as political figures, but as witnesses. They didn't just want change. They were the change. There were also children in the crowd. Young black girls with ribbons in their hair. Boys with hand-drawn signs. Parents hoisted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the speaker voices. Carried over loudspeakers. To them, this wasn't just an event. It was the beginning of a new world. Some faces stood out. There was a young John Lewis, just 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech had been so fiery, so uncompromising that senior leaders asked him to tone it down minutes before he went on stage. He agreed, but just barely. His call for radical change still shook the crowd. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, not on her own behalf, but reading a prepared statement on behalf of other civil rights women. The organizers had faced criticism for sidelining female voices. Bates's brief but powerful message underscored a harsh reality. Even within a movement about equality, some voices still struggled to be heard. Also present were union organizers, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students of every background. They didn't all agree on strategy. Some favored King's nonviolence. Others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant posture. But for that one day, those differences didn't matter. Unity won out. It was a visual symphony of American possibility. White and black hands linked in solidarity. Freedom Now buttons pinned to chests, and the sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one. The faces in the crowd weren't just watching history unfold. They were shaping it, and none of them would ever forget what they saw. While the world saw unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but simple. What looked like a perfectly synchronized movement was in truth held together with string, sweat, and a lot of last-minute compromise. Bayard Rustin, the chief architect of the march, had to battle not just logistics, but politics. He was constantly under scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity would be used to discredit the movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King didn't remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That threat haunted every stage of planning. Then there was the issue of women's voices. Despite the critical roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to deliver major speeches on their own. Rosa Parks was in the crowd that day, revered by all. But she was not given the microphone. Behind the powerful optics of the march lay the truth. The movement still struggled with its own hierarchies and blind spots. Even within the Big Six organizations, friction bubbled. SNCC leaders were growing increasingly disillusioned with the slow pace of change and the older generation's insistence on moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism more aggressively. CORE had similar frustrations, but unity was deemed too important just for one day. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 agents to spy on organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, followed key figures, and compiled dossiers. They were convinced the march would turn violent or that communists would hijack the event. When nothing of the sort happened, they simply doubled down on their surveillance, especially of Dr. King. And let's not forget money. The march cost over $250,000, equivalent to millions today. Most of it was raised through unions and sympathetic donors, but organizers scrambled until the final hour. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also deeply human, imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished. Just like the country, it sought to heal. The sun began to dip behind the Washington Monument as the crowd slowly dispersed. People hugged, cried, sang, and lingered as long as they could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered. The signs had been raised high. The world had watched. And now the question hung heavy. In the humid August air, what happens next? In the immediate days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, though often with a tone of detached curiosity. Some called it orderly and dignified, which was code for no one rioted. Few outlets gave much space to the specific demands of the march, like the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage equivalent to around $20 today. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That at least could not be ignored. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the idea of the march, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration and perhaps surprise. He called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House immediately afterward, but legislative movement remained slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stalled in Congress, caught in the claws of Southern opposition. Some activists were disappointed. They had hoped the march would result in immediate action. Instead, it was back to the grind, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who paid the price for justice. Just weeks later, that reality hit hard. On September 15, 1963, 4 black girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham. The dream had been voiced, yes, but the nightmare wasn't over. Still, something had changed. The March on Washington marked a new phase in the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a coalition broader than ever before. Labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class Americans, all in one place, united by justice. And most of all, it gave the movement a voice. A dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the world. The march was over, but the road was just beginning. And that road would soon lead through blood, legislation, and transformation. The March on Washington didn't just rattle the conscience of America. It reshaped its moral landscape. What had begun as an audacious act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently altering how Americans understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. In legislative terms, the march didn't yield immediate victories, but it created momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the very heart of Jim Crow laws. Would these bills have passed without the march? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force, the same undeniable public pressure? Probably not. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech that day propelled him into a new realm. He went from respected leader to global icon. But fame came with cost, surveillance, threats, and ultimately assassination in 1968. The dream he spoke of on those steps would become more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year. For the broader movement, the march showed what unity could achieve. It gave organizers a blueprint for large-scale mobilization, and it inspired a generation of activists both in the U.S. and abroad. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders across the globe would cite the March on Washington as a model. But the legacy isn't just historical. The language of the march, the idea of jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance, the echoes of I Have a Dream still pulses through modern protest. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, Echoes of 1963 reverberate with every chant and every cardboard sign in Washington, D.C. King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors walk past his towering likeness carved in stone with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the real memorial isn't in stone. It's in classrooms, voting booths, marches, and voices refusing to stay silent because the dream wasn't meant to rest in history books. It was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since that summer afternoon when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools. His voice, steady and strong, echoes in national memory like a sacred refrain. But for many, the question remains, has the dream been realized or has it merely been delayed? In some ways, progress is undeniable. The legal framework of segregation was dismantled. Voting rights, though now under fresh assault in many states, were won through blood, marches, and court battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was unthinkable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once illegal in much of the country, is now protected by federal law. These are not small things. They are victories carved out by relentless struggle. And yet the original demands of the march, the ones often overshadowed by King's speech, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage, still unmet. Racial disparities in education, housing, employment, and healthcare remain entrenched. Police brutality, the very thing that sparked much of the early civil rights organizing, continues to ignite outrage and protest. The dream of true economic justice of a country where opportunity is not predetermined by zip code or skin color is still far from reality. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often using the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and indictment. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, and demand the same basic human rights. But they do so in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the conclusion. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, "This is who we are, and this is what we demand." It was a declaration, not a resolution. So the dream remains battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether it is deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled depends not on the past but on us. On the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march again and again until the dream becomes a shared lived reality.